my name is Lavinia from the M Word, and I've been interviewing Graeme, who put together a petition a few weeks ago. It's stressing the need for more school places for SEN children within specialist schools. So if you start telling me how what's your background? How did you get involved with SEN?
Yeah, absolutely. So my son was diagnosed at just over 2 with autism. And then we sort of started the fight to get him an EHCP. He's now 12. So when he got the EHCP side of things, he was like that first year's cohort when it first started. It changed over from statements.
Right.
So that was sort of teething problems in itself because it was all brand new to the staff and everything. In terms of the system, like what they do with a lot of children, they made him sort of fail first. So they wanted to go through mainstream and things like that to begin with. So he was in a mainstream nursery with sort of high level of support and stuff like that while he was getting assessed and diagnosed and things. And then we eventually got him into an assessment nursery, and then from there, a few years down the line, into a special school. But that process had taken that long that his first 2 years within the special school, he had like a one-to-one support in there because he was struggling with the transition and things. So that was 2.5 when he got his autism diagnosis. He got diagnosed with ADHD at 6 as well. And then, well, actually his first diagnosis was sensory processing disorder. He got that off the OTs because they could do like a quicker assessment than everybody else at the time.
Yes.
But what we have been blessed with, because obviously I've seen it over the years getting worse and worse and worse. Like he got his diagnosis reasonably quick, because obviously what you've seen sort of me campaigning for at the minute is more to do with the need for more special schools because there's no spaces at the minute. But obviously I'm very aware as well that waiting lists for diagnosis is a really critical state as well. So we were quite lucky with that, in that like the diagnosis process for my son sort of took no longer than maybe 9 months. But yeah,
I wonder if this is more about where you are, because you are only the second person I've heard talk about a assessment nursery. And the only other place I've heard that from is in the Leeds area. Now you're not too far from there, so I find that quite interesting. And when you get a sort of assessment nursery, the game plan changes, doesn't it? Because it's about assessing, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did you get into the assessment nursery then?
Yeah, so we're quite lucky in North Tyneside in that, obviously, again, as I say, at the minute, we're experiencing very, very few spaces right now. But in terms of the area, with it being not that big geographically, we probably do have a reasonable amount of special schools. I could probably, off the top of my head, think of 6. One of them,
that's quite impressive.
Yeah, but as I say, even those are full. But no, in terms of the positive anyway. So when my son was young, we were going through that diagnosis process. One of the special schools is kind of like almost like a wraparound site, maybe, in that it's got mainstream attached to it too.
Yes.
But within that, they've got what's called sort of the Dean Communication Centre, which is like purely just an assessment nursery placement. He was in there for, I think it was roughly like 10 weeks or something, where they had like specialist TAs and educational psychologists and stuff like that. So obviously what that did is, well, yeah, it sped up his sort of EHCP process and gave a load of evidence and things like that. So
yes, but you also stated that you've managed to get both autism and ADHD assessed and diagnosed. And again, that's quite unusual, isn't it? Because what we've got is generally that they only have the financial capacity to screen for one, and then you go back into a queue to screen for the next, don't you? So it feels like it's been extremely instrumental by having an assessment nursery over 10 weeks. In the grand scheme of things, it's actually quite a short period of time, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah.
So that presumably means that there is more opportunity for more children to come into the nursery just for 10 weeks to be screened or observed rather, and then obviously formally diagnosed. That seems an amazing system.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a lot of years since he done it, so hopefully it's still working reasonably well. But certainly at the time, it was something that was really beneficial. It meant that we were face to face with professionals and stuff as well, and they had where you could go and like see your children and stuff like that, and they were getting the high level of intervention, and they had like how do you describe it? One of those sort of, you almost see them in the police stations, the glass where the children can't see through.
Yes, yes, yes.
So sort of from a parent's perspective, that was really nice too. And like when they were trying different things with him and stuff. And it's just one of those things, like when he was right at the beginning of his diagnosis, that there was something called like there was an early bird program for like sort of newly diagnosed children and the parents and stuff. So it was just another thing for us to go through where we knew we weren't alone and seeing other children that were struggling as well. And it's just a really therapeutic thing as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. So did you then kind of build a network of other parents in your situation?
Yeah, well, certainly at the time, it's not really nice to dwell on it too much, but it's also really true in the like over the years, especially as you got older and stuff like that, you try and sort of make connections with parents and stuff like that, because like the SEN world can be quite isolating.
Yes.
So like sometimes over the years when you first start school and things like that, you do build a couple of connections and things, but it's like unfortunately they don't always stay there. And certainly with the latest fight of getting my son's now 12 and my stepson into schools and stuff as well, like it kind of never stops. And you focus you sometimes end up forgetting about yourself and focusing more on what the kids really need and stuff. And
yeah.
Adult time's few and far between at the minute, I would say, if I'm honest.
Got you. So at what point then did you kind of steer into the kind of political arena?
Yeah, so that was, so fast forward in a good few years now. So myself and my partner Paige, she's got 2 children of her own. Her oldest son, Oliver, has something called Angelman syndrome.
Right.
Which is a really, really, really rare diagnosis. But the way I try and describe it to people is that he presents, bless him, as sort of horrible phrase, and I know there's better phrases out there, but I was just trying to think of one at the minute. So sort of low functioning autistic. He's pre-verbal and stuff like that. But he's also got mobility difficulties.
Yeah.
And what Paige told me when I first met her is that he kind of, well, yeah, she said that before they changed the name to Angelman's, it was once called Happy Puppet Syndrome, and that it's a good. It's not the nicest of phrase, but it's also a good depiction of like how he moves. Bless him. So he is like overly happy and giggly and smiley and stuff. And he does walk a little bit unsteady on his feet, and sometimes it is as if he's got like strings above him kind of thing.
Yes.
But bless him, he has a lot of difficulties and a lot of support needs and stuff. So what triggered the whole political thing and the need for looking into this and trying to sort of galvanise support and see what was going on across the rest of the country is what I've touched on earlier, which is the getting into special skills problem that there is at the minute amongst all the rest of the crises. So so my son, like I say, was transitioning to secondary school, and Oliver was also needing a primary school. And lo and behold, both situations, both chocker. And it's specifically talking about Oliver, the situation was worse for him because he just, after I think Paige was fighting for probably about 2 years, his situation was waiting even longer for his EHCP process. That got done at the very last minute. The nursery that he was was supposed to be in for 30 hours with portage support, but you're talking he was in there probably 6 hours a week and always getting sent home early and stuff because they couldn't cope with him. Yeah, so with Oliver's stuff, we found very quickly that the council at the time was saying they had no spaces in their special schools. We rang around the different boroughs. So you've got South Tyneside Council, North Tyneside, Gateshead, Newcastle, Sunderland, Durham. We rang around Durham and all sorts because it's not that far away, and they're all saying they're full and they've got waiting lists and things. So the local council said mainstream on his EHCP. We were like, in absolutely no way could he ever cope in mainstream. This can't be a thing. So it was just a case of meeting after meeting and sort of trying to get his professionals to persuade the local authority and stuff. And we'd filled in the tribunal process, and we had somebody from Sendias on board and stuff like that, and got to the last minute, and then they gave in kind of thing, luckily. So we didn't end up getting to tribunal per se, but I think if we had, it would have been quite intense, I think, because it's so very obvious the high level of need he has. And I would like to think that whoever would be in charge of the tribunal would give the local authority a good telling off, because he just could not cope in a mainstream setting. So that's sort of Oliver's story. He's now in the specialist school, because there's in terms of the Gateshead area, there's 2. So he's in there now. They're oversubscribed, as I thought they would be, so they've got a class of 12. But the reassuring thing there is that they've upped because it's only 1 and 2 special schools, the council have upped the staffing ratio. Right. So it's still as if it was a smaller class. In the essence of how many staff they've got in there, so there's supposed to be 6. Right. And they've also acknowledged within his first few terms in there that he's got a 1-to-1 as well. Right. So I think it just really homes in the level of support that he needs. Luckily,
so really the school has doubled, or rather the class has doubled.
Yep.
Due to demand, there is an absolute need for it. And what you're saying is that they've also increased the funding for more staff, so that although it should be 6 with however many staff, they've doubled numbers, but also doubled the numbers of staff. Is that right?
It seems that way, and I think that's probably out of, well, I don't know the facts and figures because I've not sort of said to them specifically about it, but I imagine it's probably out of desperation, because they've only got the 2 buildings. And obviously I don't know the sort of political figures and the funding bands and all the rest of it, but for an area the size of Gateshead in terms of the population and stuff, I would imagine they'd have more than 2, but they just don't. And I'm sure that from what I'm been finding when I'm speaking to other parents, that seems to be the case all over the country.
Yes.
And then, so with Kieran's story, in terms of getting him into his school that he's now in at the minute, he had, again, bless him, his process was reasonably easy in the sense that he already had an EHCP. There was evidence in place that he needed a special school and things. But because he's that bit more higher functioning, really quite literal, triggered with a lot of sort of verbal situations and stuff like that, it was the case of we had to really find the right school for him. And we had an education psychologist put a bit of a plan together and explain that he would really struggle with transition if X, Y, and Z wasn't done and his needs weren't sort of met effectively and things. So in terms of his needs, getting up to the secondary level, in terms of the local authority schools, in our area, there isn't an ASD specific one. It's just like a general LD one. So he went and did his sort of few days assessment ready for secondary school, and that just completely fell apart. They didn't understand him at all. They really triggered him, and as you can imagine, because that's another sort of topic of which I sort of, I've seen a little bit of in that small snippet there, and I know there's lots of children at the minute with ranges of diagnoses. There's a lot of them obviously with mental health difficulties as well that are a part of this big group of children that are understandably refusing to go to school. Which is a world I'm not really particularly savvy to, but I think if it hadn't fought from that point onwards, he probably would have been sat with the rest of those children that are really struggling with attending school at the minute. So from that point, it was sort of a race against time to then look at what other school options there was. Like with Oliver's situation, we were ringing round, finding that they were all full at secondary level and things like that. And that's sort of, as I say, within like 3 or 4 local authorities. Did some more research, because I know this is kind of the thing that local authorities are going to sort of keep a little bit quiet. So we started looking at independent special schools.
Yes.
and we found one in the middle of Newcastle city centre. Pushed and pushed for that. Again, the local authority locally accepted to fund it. We had a little bit of hoo-ha in regards to transport, because I know that was another thing I've seen, certainly at the beginning of this sort of school year in terms of September. That was all over social media in terms of taxis either not turning up or just not having the numbers there for the young people to get to schools.
Yeah.
We thought that as well. But no, luckily we've landed on my feet. But as I say, the reason why I put this together is the trauma that we went through as a family in terms of how it represented the fight that we undertook, which we're always going to do, but we shouldn't have done. And then, like I say, in speaking to all those different families and all those different families that have responded to the post that I put out and stuff like that, and you just see the story happening
Over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, did you just wake up one day and go, do you know what, I'm going to put a petition together? Or did you talk to somebody else and they say, you know, we should really put a petition together? Tell me how it happened, because lots of people will say, this is what we need to do. And that's all you ever hear about it.
Yeah. So we'd sort of tried every single avenue in terms of the local authority stuff. We've seen, obviously, this wasn't right. This was myself and my partner talking to page. What I haven't touched on yet is my line of work as well. So I work within social care. So the other side of things that I've seen a lot is, obviously, I see it a lot from a sort of personal parent perspective. But when I'm going and doing work and picking up the youngsters from the different schools and stuff like that, like what I was saying with the class size in there at this one, Kate said that Oliver's in, the car parks are absolutely heaving. So the schools that I'm attending for work and stuff, they're massively oversubscribed.
Yes.
I've seen them so busy. But no, just back to the petition process. So yeah, there wasn't really much of a push, to be honest. It was just I didn't really speak with sort of many people about it. It was just sort of maybe just a couple of local parents in terms of like experiences up here and what was going on and stuff. And I just thought, you know what, I'm seeing loads on social media at the minute. Lots of talk in terms of the different crises with the different industries and stuff like that. But again, like I touched on earlier in the conversation there, a big gap in that I wasn't seeing enough in the news in regards to what's happening to young people, specifically young people with additional needs and things. And just thought, right, well, let's just see what we can do, what sort of numbers we can get, and what, if anything, will come from it. Because it just, the last thing I'd seen of it in doing my research is I've seen that there was a couple of protests put together. I think it was like the 2019 sort of time frame and stuff like that. But it just shows like it's the problem's only getting worse.
For sure. For sure.
Nothing's getting fixed. Nothing's getting sort of done. Things are just that the can's basically just sort of been kicked down the road, kind of thing. And yeah.
So if you're doing your research and you found that actually the last time that there was a major protest about SEND schools was 2019, what do you think happened between then and now? Was there actually anything follow through, or did we have so many changes of MPs and prime ministers that it just got forgotten about?
Yeah, but the latter, I would say. But also we've got the we've got the thing of just this government, and obviously we don't know with other governments really in terms of what they would actually effectively do on the ground. But I think that's the point. So on the ground over the last few years, I've just seen nothing happening, and I think that's the point really, in that you can do flashy stuff through the media and stuff like that, but you've got to sort of see it go through the grassroots really in terms of how it's actually going to impact the children and things. And I think that pressure, going back to it, you've got that three-pronged. Well, it's a huge crisis right now, and it's three-pronged. So you've got the length of waiting times for diagnosis, you've got the lack of spaces, and you've got the huge crisis we've got in staffing and retention in social care as well. So that whole package that a disabled young person needs is just absolutely falling apart. And as harsh as it might sound, it's probably true as well. So this particular government, in terms of their ethos and stuff like that, I just don't think that they will ever be concerned about the most vulnerable in society, or they certainly don't ever come across as if they would be. So it's just about trying to sort of find a voice.
Right. So this is something that you really wanted to see, really, you know, rather than just do something and say, okay, I've done it. You wanted something that was going to change.
Absolutely, yeah, because it's a really big problem. And I know it affects not just my two boys, but children up and down the country.
I suppose my concern is, you know, you and I have both identified that there is not enough places, not enough schools, not enough specialist understanding and care. My concern is that if we don't have enough resources at ground level, you know, like we were talking about how your son went through the assessment nursery.
Yeah.
If you think about, a lot of people are told that they can't possibly have their children screened until they're at least 8. That to me is a barrier, but it's more about not telling the truth of what's really happening. It's not about the mentality of it. It's about the fact that there is no funding. And so if there is no funding, you're going to have to take it for where it's really needed. And that means being very reactive, doesn't it? So children who are sort of heading towards secondary school are going to need it more so than younger children. The difficulty I have, again, is with, if we don't have the resources to screen, we can quite happily be blind and say, oh, you know, these children are fine in school. When in actual fact, if we were screening at a very early age, we'd probably see a higher number. So like your nursery was able to do 10 weeks for several children. I mean, I don't know how many were in the nursery, but an average nursery would have at least an intake of 30. And if you were able to screen 30 children for 10 weeks, and then, you know, there are 52 weeks in the year, so presumably you could at least get another 2 intakes of 30 children. That's quite an interesting number. They say at the moment, I think it's 1 in 100 child or children rather are screened with autism. But I think that number's far higher. What do you think in your life experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. I echo everything you've just said. And for me, as you say, it's the funding issue. So you go back there. I mean, certainly when my son was younger, you had the paediatricians and things at the time. But when you start hearing them banding ages of when they're expected to diagnose and stuff like that, as a parent, you sit up and go, right, I'm going to fight this. But even at the time, sort of like, between sort of 10 and 8 years ago now, when he was going through the diagnosis process, like they were saying like 6-year-old in terms of traditionally when they would start looking at diagnosis and stuff like that. But if someone, regardless of your age, if they're hitting the criteria and they have those additional needs and things like that, then they deserve the support and they deserve the recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also think if we're thinking about already schools, that there aren't enough schools and there aren't enough places, but there isn't enough screening, actually, this is a far bigger problem than we could possibly imagine. Now, one of the things that I am intrigued about is that with the best will in the world, I think you're in quite an unusual category. And what I mean by that is that there is an awful lot of men or dads who are working and they are not able to spend as much time as you fighting for things. More often than not, what you find is it's the mum who's doing an awful lot of the fighting, filling out the EHCPs, fighting. So it's quite unusual. And do you think that in itself, being a rarity, do you think that in itself allows you to have a more commanding voice about, you know, this is not going to be ignored when I put forward this petition?
Possibly. Just, well, yeah, going back to the different groups and things, like even when I'm putting out the posts and getting answers back and stuff like that, kind of as you pointed out, you've got that response there, it's mums. Like,
yeah,
you're probably talking, I could probably count on 2 hands how many dads have been in touch with us.
yeah.
And it just shows, well, across everything really, the sort of how tough things are, not just for the youngsters but for families at the minute. And obviously, like as you pointed out there, the dads do need to be around and be able to support the family and things, but due to electricity bills and all the rest of it,
Yeah,
give all the pennies they can together to keep the family sort of going. And as obviously you've touched on it there's a lot of pressure on mums at the minute in terms of trying to get all this stuff done and fighting a system which is completely against them and against any sort of speed of support for the children.
yeah. And the other thing I think as well is, you alone as a parent know how long it takes you to fill out all these forms, how long it takes you to get a meeting with a school to discuss your concerns. It's lengthy trying to get an educational psychologist in to kind of say, yes, there are 3 rounds that have proven that what we can offer is not working, therefore we need to consider a specialist school. There are so many barriers for parents. It's proving a bit of a nightmare, isn't it? And actually, the thing that I am very concerned about is if the country has an understanding that autism is 1 in 100, when you and I see a very different picture, you don't have to go far on your phone looking at different groups. There is a much greater need than is actually being addressed.
Yeah.
And I know in Wales that they're talking about, you don't have to have a formal diagnosis to get the help. But try telling that to several parents who are always met with resistance from schools or indeed other agencies. I think that's really quite tough.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more about you getting your petition together then. So what did you do? How did that come about? You must have put pen to paper when thinking about what you're going to put in it. How did it all come about?
So, like I say, it was just obviously watching the 2 lads' experience with my son. He's actually sat next to us right now.
Hello.
Hello. Just come in the sitting room there while we were talking. It was just awful seeing how stressed out he was and stuff like that. And I just obviously wanted to sort of raise our story a little bit and then sort of help out where I could with other families. So not really a fancy process really, and it was an electronic one. So yeah. I just learned. I did a bit of a Google, bit of research in terms of what it involves. Found the appropriate website. So there's the one I used was the government one, and the reason I picked that one is because I knew that they would have to respond. Because from looking at other bits and pieces, they don't necessarily have to respond to your different websites. So you change change.org, something like that, the different other platforms for the petitions and things. And it seemed like at the time, potentially, because I wasn't sure what numbers would come back, but to have that threshold of the 10,000 signatures, I was thinking in the back of my mind that might be achievable in terms of making the government respond in some way, shape or form, because that's the sort of threshold they had. So all it really took process-wise was for me to put, like you say, some words together, which I can't remember what they were off the top of my head, but I put something together which then had to be sort of vetted by this petitions commission kind of thing, and they changed some of the wording and stuff. And obviously, it probably wasn't as passionate as I would like, but in terms of getting it pushed through, that's all that really matters in terms of the people seeing generally what it is I was asking for. I think we might have potentially got bigger numbers if at the time I hadn't dropped in one phrase, which I just talked about the Northeast. Obviously, when I was posting it around everywhere, I says, I know this is a national problem, and was emphasising that. But I suppose what maybe's pushed it over the edge towards the end, you're talking in the sort of 3 constituencies in the Sunderland area, ended up with like over 1,000 people signing and stuff. So it got there in the end in terms of numbers. But the process wasn't really that complicated. It was a case of I put those words together, this petition commission approved it. I then had to get the initial 5 signatures, and then I just started posting it absolutely all over the place. Facebook itself wasn't that easy in terms of I got sort of halfway through the process, and I think I'd been pinging stuff that around that often. It was a case of they kept blocking us and kept stopping us from posting things and stuff, which was obviously quite frustrating. But once it kind of got over the halfway mark, it was kind of out there, and there was enough people seeing it to start seeing the numbers ticking up and things like that. But it was a funny old process. My son comes over 2 nights a week, and most of the time when he came around, one of the things he'd ask us is how many signatures are we on, Dad?
How many signatures? Yes, yeah. And did you find there were pockets where they were really, really supportive?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of there's a few sort of pages and groups and stuff got on board with it, including your own. I got some big responses from parents that were involved with some of the educational consultants, so the people that are driving the tribunal appeals and stuff like that, in terms of numbers that come through from them. And some of the time, it was only a couple of times actually, because I understand that it's a very really sort of divided topic, and that like it takes a long while, I think, for a parent to get their head round if they're okay with the child attention special skills. So sometimes I'd meet a little bit of resistance. It didn't happen very often actually, but sometimes you'd get a parent who was like, they don't want that for the child. But again, you respect that opinion. And I think considering it didn't end up getting, unfortunately, any sort of national media attention, to get the nearly 17,000 signatures just off passing it around, I think.
How many? 17?
Yeah, nearly 17,000.
Wow, that's really good, isn't it?
Absolutely. Considering, like I say, it was just a case of passing it around the internet and hoping for the best. I mean, I pestered as many sort of local media branches as I could. We nearly got there with ITV Time Tees, because there was parent and some councillors up at Hexham had mentioned it to them at the time, and they hadn't put it on the TV and things. But no, just I think considering it in terms of the window of people actually seeing it, if it had gone a bit more national, I think it probably would have had even more sort of numbers attached to it. But I think that first goal of that 10,000 signatures, when I first put it together, I thought in the back of my mind this might be achievable. As we got closer, I think you were talking, it was like I had 4 weeks left, and I was still on like maybe 7,000 or 8,000 and stuff like that. So I was thinking, is this going to happen, kind of thing? And then there was sort of a few other charities jumped on board, and I got what did they call them? What's the acronym? So there's a fancy acronym for those children that are taught at home.
Right.
I think, is it
EOTUS.
That's the one. Yeah. So there was one of the groups that does that side of things got on board with it. And when that started sort of getting passed around as well, it was a case of, again, I seen the numbers jump up.
Yeah.
But as I say, with that one, there was a couple of, there was never any arguments come of it, and there was never any nastiness, which is good. But there was a couple of parents on that, understandably, was, okay, either school's not right for them, and that's the version that they want, kind of thing, in terms of homeschooling with some level of support and tutoring. Or obviously, like I say, wanting to remain in mainstream with a high level of support, because obviously what every parent wants is it's an individual thing for their young person. But in terms of our story and others that I've spoke to, yeah, special schools, they need more of them. They need a higher level of support. Some of them probably need rebuilt in terms of how long they've been around and how much the buildings are crumbling and stuff now as well.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a rather large, interesting area, in that I think you're a lot younger than me, but when I was attending secondary school, we had colleges. You weren't expected to stay within secondary school. And if there were other things that you could be doing, you could leave earlier. And there was a real cull of technology colleges, a real cull. And there was a real emphasis that colleges should really start thinking about being the equivalent of degree levels, far more academic. And I think we've gone wrong with that, because actually what we've done with recognizing that there is very, very few specialist schools is that we are now having to reinvent the wheel. We are now having to think about schools and colleges that can support special needs. Now, this special needs is a bit of an interesting one, because I know you've identified that there are parents, not many of them, who said, you know, I don't want my child to go to a specialist school. I want them to maintain being in a mainstream education. And this is quite intriguing, because I too have experienced a few parents who have suggested and poo-pooed the idea that their child may be autistic. You know, it's absolutely not that. And I wonder if it's because we are so judgmental as a society, we almost put down what it's like to be autistic. Now, I've got a theory that actually there are so many people who are left-handed and were allowed to remain left-handed, but equally there's a high number of people who were left-handed who were forced to write with their right hand.
I'm guessing that's the reason why most people who are ambidextrous were originally left-handed.
There you go, you see. But I also think in the same way that there is probably nearer 50% of the globe who are autistic. And to suggest that we need specialist schools is really a bit sad, because actually there are some very academic, very able students who are autistic but who cannot cope with school environments, and they need smaller schools like independent private schools who provide that small class, and therefore the sensory around noise goes right down. I also think that we are so determined as a government that we're providing secondary schools, particularly large areas with large classes, constantly moving around. You know, it's not just 1 or 2 classes in that year, it's 8 or 9. And naturally, staff and children cannot cope with all that pressure of moving around. And I think because autism was not really known about, you know, we only knew it was about Asperger's sort of like 50 years ago, because of our environments have changed so much, and the demands are now more so on young people and teachers. I think now people are beginning to recognize autism for what it really is, in that, you know, it's really sensory. It's really, you can be quite fixated in your thinking about certain things, and you certainly don't see the world the same way as a neurotypical. But nevertheless, why are we having to now reinvent the wheel when it comes to education? Because actually, there are lots of companies out there who think, well, this is easy. We'll set up a specialist school and we'll charge the local authorities an absolute fortune. Whereas if we were a bit more savvy with it, what do you need? Do you need smaller classrooms? Do you need movement to, you know, to time and space to move around freely while you're processing? Do we need to bring back colleges and schools where it's not so academically minded?
Absolutely.
Rather than making it so competitive and failing so many children. And obviously the biggest thing that we're doing is that we're making more of a demand on agencies like CAMHS, because people's mental health are deteriorating dramatically, aren't they? When they feel they can't go to a normal school, and they can't be seen as normal, because that's some of the parents' worries, isn't it? When they're saying, you know, I don't want my child to go to a specialist school, there's nothing wrong with them. No, but there is, in that society dictates that autism is a problem, when in actual fact, I still think autism is probably affecting half the globe.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
I would agree with all of that. In that there's supposed to be, at the minute, in terms of it being a bit more out there, so hopefully more people are aware of the condition, and we've just changed the sort of symbol in terms of the infinity loop and stuff like that, and There's supposed to be, what is it these days? Autism acceptance rather than awareness and stuff like that. So it's becoming, like you've just said there, the inverted commas thing of popular. But you're then going in the realms of, because it's then popular, you're overwhelming a system and stuff like that. But yes, absolutely. You mentioned the independent schools things there. Like Kane's incredibly lucky, and I'm really chuffed that we found an independent school, because that's the loophole for him. In that, yeah, absolutely. If mainstream in inverted commas was a lot more bespoke, he could well have had the opportunity to give it a good go.
Yeah.
But the point is, for me, I would prefer him definitely to be where he's remained at, because he's getting a lot of extra support now. He's getting the ability, when he gets to that stage, to try GCSEs and stuff like that. He's going to have work placement support and all sorts. So everything he needs, he's now got in that school.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably, like you've touched on, one of the loopholes at the minute, because certain companies and certain people are aware of stuff. They'll go, as you rightly pointed out there, okay, we'll build something, we'll fill the gap, we'll get the money off the government. But I suppose the flip side of it is, if people didn't do that, then youngsters like my son, who kind of sort of sit in that halfway house situation of they could potentially succeed at mainstream, but they can't, because of, like you say, the society sort of set up at the minute, and then the fact that there's so many children in these schools, he wouldn't be able to do it. But given the right tools, he probably could.
Yeah.
But no, I think he's landed on his feet now, which is really, really good. But as I say, I know there's so many children that aren't, because I would imagine not only local authority skills are a rare thing, I would imagine also the independent ones are probably even rarer.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting, because I remember years ago, there was so many private independent schools, and they have to survive as a business. And certainly there have been a large reduction of schools closing, which is very unfortunate. But these schools should consider that they potentially could fill a very necessary gap.
Yeah.
The difficulty that they might have to consider is that, over the last 2 years, we've seen a wave of social and emotional mental health schools cropping up all over the country, but they don't deal with pathological demand avoidance.
Yeah.
And in fact, they go the wrong way about how to support young people with that. They believe that if they're very strict with their boundaries, if they do rewards and sanctions, these will help. And actually, for an autistic person with PDA, this is the worst nightmare on Elm Street syndrome, because it's absolutely the wrong way. But that doesn't mean, without real understanding, that these schools could be tweaked to provide. But again, they charge an awful lot of money to local authorities, and strangely, they don't have mental health nurses supporting staff within them. So it's interesting how it's a social and emotional mental health sort of education provider, but they don't, it's just teaching staff. It's not mental health nurses supporting it. So I always find that very interesting as to how they can support young people with mental health and autism, usually undiagnosed within these schools. So it's quite difficult, isn't it? What we're saying is there isn't enough specialist schools. There isn't enough independent schools that could perhaps fill the gap with more academically able autistic young people who cannot cope within mainstream environment. And schools, I think, right across all three might potentially be oversubscribed.
Yeah, definitely.
So with your lovely 17,000 petitioners' signatures, what happens now? Because obviously the closing date's finished, hasn't it? Did that finish last week?
Yeah, that's it. So we've got the response come through. So everyone that signed got their own individual email with the response on it and stuff. And obviously I put it up as well. So what literally happens is, what I then tried to sort of push a few of the MPs to get a response, like a specific response and stuff like that. But as you're probably fully aware, they just go quiet. So that response has come out there. I've got, fingers crossed, a couple of things in the pipeline in terms of, I've had a couple of conversations with the union that I'm in and stuff like that in terms of if they want to take it on. I've had a media company in London say that they were planning on putting an interview together with an MP that asked us at the time which one I might be interested in. So I opted for the Shadow Education Secretary. Obviously, one with the being up here in the Sunderland area in terms of the level of signatures and stuff like that. According to them, she's not responded as of yet.
Right.
So that's all in the pipeline in terms of wanting to take it further. I also have the opportunity again in the pipeline, because I've double checked that I can do it. So take like a paper copy and a letter and stuff to Dowling Street as well. But in terms of what literally happens next, it's about those in power actually realizing that it exists and wanting to sort of help us out with it. And as I say, in terms of national media and your MP stuff, in terms of the only MPs that have got back to us in terms of sort of in that political circle as I've had, who's going to be the Labour candidate for Dalton up here. She sort of got in touch with us, and as I say, there was a couple of councillors in the Hexham area. But apart from that, I've had no feedback from anybody else in the political circle. But that's the problem. It's those in the sort of halls of power that could make a difference off the back of something like this. There's that much going on at the minute. Hopefully I've started something. Hopefully you've got, as I say, those nearly 17,000 people that are aware that I tried this. And it sort of will hopefully galvanise parents and families to sort of do as much as they can, really, because I think I've put it out there now, and it's just a case of sort of keep pushing in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, I think it's about not taking your foot off the gas, because otherwise it's going to end up being like 2019, isn't it? 5 years ago, you get to a point where you can't do anymore. And I suppose as well, it's also reflective. Why aren't we getting more numbers in the government halls? Why are there so few who are coming on board as politicians with us? And I think part of that again is what does resonate with them, for them to kind of say, yes, there is a need for this. Because again, it reiterates, if there is so few numbers, i.e. 1 in 100 children with autism, when actually you and I would argue that, absolutely refute, there is more than 1 in 100. Interestingly, I was reading an article the other day, and somebody in Korea had done research, and they argued that 2/3 of their population were autistic. That's interesting, isn't it? I think it's about, if there is a greater need reflected in numbers, it will get to the point where people would then have to start really sitting up and taking notice. But because I think it's seen as such a small number, it's only getting the recognition from people who, have something that resonates with them. But it's certainly about you keeping your foot on the gas, really, to not let it drop. So yeah, and by all means, if there's anything we can do to help, let us know, because obviously this is quite a big subject for us as well. And when I'm doing mental health assessments, I find it really difficult when there are so many schools who constantly say that children are fine in school, and they're not seeing what I see as a mental health specialist. So it's really tricky, because there's an awful lot of people who are struggling. And I say people because it's not just young people. There are parents who are struggling. There are teachers who are struggling. There are so many people struggling with the education and the demands that are on the education. But there seems to be no understanding or no appreciation or no respect for the fact that mental health is just the lowest criteria. So to give you an example, staff are more worried about attendance. Is the school getting full attendance for every single pupil? And then are their grades good enough? And you think, hang on a minute, how can you force a young person to school if they are so full of anxiety and their mental health is breaking down? Why is the the energy fixated on you must get this child into school, when in actual fact, surely every child's entitled to an education, but surely that's about finding the correct environment for them, so that they're not anxious and that they actually have the capacity to take in the learning. If you're terribly anxious, you're not going to take any learning in, you know.
Yep, that's it, absolutely. But no, we've sort of circled around it a little bit, but it goes back to the acronym I mentioned before and stuff, in terms of how it's affecting not just our autistic youngsters, but just lots of youngsters in general, in that there's so many of them refusing to go to school at the minute, or finding school too difficult to then obviously need a different type of learning. But yeah, there is also, as when I've done me sort of looking around the different social media sites and different groups and stuff like that, there's also a lot on the pressures of the attendance thing, so trying to get that removed in terms of getting rid of attendance certificates. I don't know a lot about it, but when I started looking around, there was a schools bill that had got sort of pushed back off. There was a lot of parents who had sort of fought against that and stuff like that, and I think that was to do with they were wanting to create a register or scrutinise more families and young people and stuff that weren't under like a schools register kind of thing. And I think, yeah, it's just there's so many areas that are creaking at the minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Graeme. It's been really a pleasure to sort of hear what you've been doing and how you went about it. I hope at some point you can come back and tell us a bit more about what's been going on in the interim period with you keeping your foot on the gas. Yeah,
hopefully something comes of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so I'll say goodbye for now for the benefit of our viewers. Thank you very much for attending and helping us out and teaching us all a bit more about what you've been doing, but also thank you to our viewers who've been watching. My name is Lavinia from the M Word, and I've been interviewing Graeme, who put together a petition a few weeks ago. It's stressing the need for more school places for SEN children within specialist schools. Hopefully you'll be back soon to kind of give us an update.